Have you ever walked down the same street on different days? And somehow, it felt like a completely different world. One morning, the sunlight paints the leaves gold, the breeze feels like a quiet blessing, and people smile as if life is gently unfolding in your favor. Another day, same street, same building, same sky, but suddenly everything feels heavy. The trees look dull, the noise is louder, strangers' faces seem colder, and you wonder what changed. The answer isn't out there, it's in here. Inside your mind. Most of us spend our lives reacting to what we think is the world, but what we're really reacting to is our own perception of it. The world didn't change, you did. And that subtle shift, your inner state, your thoughts, your emotions, colors everything you see. Like a pair of glasses you never realized you were wearing. You weren't born with them. They formed slowly, shaped by past wounds, childhood echoes, silent expectations, and the stories you told yourself to make sense of life. But over time, those lenses started to harden. And now, they decide what you notice, what you fear, what you love, and what you never give a second glance. In Buddhism, there's a powerful phrase: the mind is the forerunner of all things. What you think you become, what you believe you project, and what you cling to defines the world you live in. Let that settle for a moment. What if suffering wasn't caused by what happened, but by how you saw it, not by what people did, but by the story your mind whispered afterward? We're not taught to question our lenses. We're taught to clean the world instead, to fix others, fix situations, fix everything, except the self. But what if all that fixing is like wiping a mirror while ignoring the dust in your eyes? Take anger, for example. Two people cut off in traffic. One explodes, fists clenched, heart racing, screaming at a windshield. The other sighs and lets it go. Same event. Two entirely different inner worlds. So where's the real problem? Out there or in here? Zen masters say, when the mind is at peace, the world too is at peace. It sounds poetic until you live it. Then it becomes truth. Your experience of the world isn't dictated by what's out there. It's sculpted by the quality of your awareness. Most people think they need to travel to feel alive, but what they really need is to see differently. There are people who live in paradise yet carry hell within them, and others who live in chaos but walk with grace. The difference isn't luck, it's perception, it's the lens. And here's the most humbling part: you don't see the world as it is, you see the world as you are. Every fear, every resentment, every craving filters your vision, so when you change how you see, you don't just feel better, you start to live in a completely different world. That's not magic, that's awakening. Because here's the secret: there is no single, solid world out there. What we call reality is a moving picture made of sense impressions, memories, mental habits, and interpretations. Your world is stitched together moment by the mind. And that means it can be unstitched. You're not trapped in your story. You're just wearing it like a robe. You can take it off. You can remove the lens. You can learn to look again. Not through judgment, not through fear, not through past pain, but with stillness, with clarity. And when you do, something extraordinary happens. The world, without changing a single thing, starts to feel different, more spacious, more peaceful, more alive, because now you're not just reacting, you're seeing. That is the beginning of real freedom. Not changing the weather, but stepping out of the storm inside. Not controlling others, but releasing the grip of your own mind. Not chasing happiness, but removing the filter that blurred it all along. It's not always easy. The mind resists. It clings to what it knows, even suffering. But if you're willing to sit still long enough, to become curious instead of reactive, to observe without instantly labeling, then, little by little, you'll begin to notice the lens. And once seen, it can be softened, it can be cleaned, or simply let go. There's a reason the Buddha didn't point outward, he pointed inward to the mind, to the view, because when your view shifts, your life shifts. And when your life shifts, the world does too, without needing to change at all. The street is the same, the sky hasn't moved, but you're no longer looking through the same eyes. Sometimes, the most radical transformation doesn't begin with action, but with awareness, not with doing more, but with seeing clearly, and from that clear seeing, a new world emerges, not a fantasy, not a dream, but one that was always there, just waiting for you to open your eyes. It's easy to believe the world is just out there, fixed, independent, hard like stone, cold like fact, and we just observers trapped in its design. But have you ever paused and wondered how much of what you call reality is actually shaped by your own mind? Two people walk into the same room. One sees warmth, the other feels tension, same lights, same space, different realities. So, what's real? In Buddhist thought, reality is not an objective monolith. It's a dance of mind and form, of perception and projection. It's not the stage itself, it's how the spotlight moves. We don't experience things as they are. We experience them as we are, like the moon reflected on water. What you see depends entirely on the stillness of the surface. Disturb the water and the image shatters. Calm it and clarity returns. And the water is your mind. Have you ever had a dream so vivid you woke up sweating, heart racing, breath short, as if it were real? But it wasn't real. It was the mind creating a world, populating it with characters, drama, landscapes, even time itself, and making you believe. Now here's the twist. Buddhist masters tell us we're doing the same thing right now. Just like in dreams, our waking world is filtered through a mind layered with memory, desire, fear, conditioning. So how much of what we call reality is actually a reflection? A man walks through the forest and feels peace. Another walks the same path and is terrified of snakes, imagining danger in every leaf. Who's seeing the truth? The truth is, both are seeing through themselves, and that's the point. The Buddha didn't come to explain the universe as a fixed external machine. He came to show us how the mind creates the experience we call the universe. So when you suffer, it's not because the world has turned against you. It's because the mind in that moment is generating a version of the world that's painful, a distorted projection, like watching a horror film through a cracked lens and thinking it's real life. But when you change the lens, the world changes. Not because the objects out there morph, but because your relationship to them transforms. And that changes everything. There's a story in the Zen tradition. A monk is sent to live in isolation on a cold, windswept mountain. He struggles. He resents the silence, the loneliness, the bitter chill. He writes to his teacher, "The mountain is too harsh, the wind too cruel, I cannot meditate here." The teacher replies, "It is not the mountain that is harsh, it is your mind." Months later, the same monk writes again, "I have fallen in love with the silence. The wind is like a song. The mountain teaches me everything. Same place, same wind, different mind. This isn't spiritual fluff. This is the very foundation of awakening. Because the most dangerous illusion isn't what you see. It's believing that what you see is all there is. The world, in its rawest form, is neutral. What makes it joyful or sorrowful is how the mind paints it. Imagine holding a prism in your hand. White light passes through, and suddenly a rainbow appears. But that rainbow, it's not in the light, it's in the prism. Just like beauty, sorrow, jealousy, wonder, they're not embedded in the world. They're filtered through the lens of you. So here's the question that starts to change everything. If your mind is the painter of your world, what kind of colors are you using? Is it fear that tints your days gray? Is it comparison that dulls your joy? Is it unhealed pain that casts long shadows across moments meant to shine? You're not powerless. You are, in fact, the artist. You're just not fully aware of the brush in your hand. That's why meditation matters. That's why mindfulness is more than a buzzword. These aren't practices for the spiritually bored. They are tools to begin seeing clearly. Not to escape life, but to finally meet it without distortion. The more you observe your thoughts, the more you realize most of them aren't truths. They're stories, assumptions, habits inherited from culture, parents, trauma, and time. But the moment you see that, you begin to loosen their grip, and space opens. Space where the world stops being an enemy, where the noise becomes music, where pain becomes a teacher, not a punishment. Reality doesn't have to be brutal. It becomes brutal when the mind resists what is. When you soften the mind, the world follows. So maybe it's not about conquering life. Maybe it's about uncovering life beneath the dust of your judgments. You don't need a new world. You need new eyes, because the truth is always here. It's just that your mind is often elsewhere, busy building a false one. And when that construction stops, even for a breath, you'll feel something ancient and familiar, a presence, a quiet, a clarity, the kind that was never added, only revealed. And in that clarity, the question is, what is reality? The real question becomes, can you be still enough to see it? And so, as the outer world carries on in its chaotic rhythm, something within begins to settle, not because the world is easier, but because the mind is clearer. And that clarity doesn't just change your perspective, it changes your life. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. At first that sounds cruel, almost dismissive, as if the ache in your chest, the weight in your mind, the wounds you carry are somehow your fault. But look closer, not with judgment, with curiosity. Because what if suffering isn't built into the event itself, but born from the meaning you assign to it? A breakup, a layoff, a betrayal, these hurt, they should. But suffering, that endless replay of thoughts, the spiral of why me, the tightening in the chest that lingers long after the moment is gone, that is crafted in the mind. A wound hurts once, but the story hurts forever. Have you ever noticed how the same event can devastate one person and liberate another? One person loses a job and falls into despair. Another sees it as the door to finally follow their passion. Same reality, different relationship to it. That relationship is perception, and perception is everything. The Buddha never promised to remove pain from life. He promised to teach us how to stop clinging to it, because it's the clinging, the resisting, the obsessing, the attaching, that turns pain into suffering. Imagine holding a hot coal in your hand. You scream from the burn, but instead of dropping it, you hold tighter. You curse the fire. You blame the heat, but never question why you're still holding on. That's suffering. And so often we hold on not because we want to, but because we believe we have to. We think letting go means forgetting, or approving, or pretending it didn't hurt. But letting go doesn't mean erasing the past. It means releasing the grip that keeps you tied to it. Here's the secret. The mind doesn't want to suffer, but it wants to be right even more. So it clings to stories. I was wronged. They should have stayed. This should not have happened. And yet it did happen. Reality doesn't care about should. It only is. And when your perception fights what is, suffering blooms. But when perception accepts what is, peace begins. In Buddhism, this isn't passive, it's powerful. Acceptance doesn't mean apathy, it means clarity. It means you stop using your mind to argue with life and start using it to understand. So many of us suffer not from events, but from the lens of expectation. We expect permanence in a world of change. We expect fairness in a world of karma. We expect control in a world ruled by cause and effect. And when those expectations are shattered, we think something's wrong. But nothing's wrong. The world is doing exactly what the Buddha said it would do. arising and passing again and again. The suffering comes from wanting it to behave otherwise. A flower blooms, then it wilts. That's not tragedy, that's truth. But the mind says, stay beautiful forever. And the moment fades, and we suffer. It's not the fading that hurts. It's the grasping. Have you ever looked back at something that once broke you, and now you barely feel it? That's not time healing, that's perception evolving. You change the story, or you stop telling it altogether. And without the story, the suffering dissolves. So maybe peace isn't found in changing your circumstances, but in changing your relationship to them. A monk once said, "Before enlightenment, I was miserable. After enlightenment, I still had rainy days, but I no longer got wet." Because suffering is not about the rain. It's about whether you keep standing in it, refusing to move, cursing the sky, forgetting you have an umbrella. And that umbrella is awareness. It's the ability to pause and ask, is this moment painful, or is it my resistance to it that hurts? Is this the end of something, or the beginning of something else? Am I suffering because of what happened, or because of what I believe it means? These questions don't erase pain, but they reveal its source. And when you know the source, you're no longer a victim. You become a participant in your own healing. There is nothing weak about choosing perception over reaction. It's the bravest thing you can do, because it means no longer blaming the world for your unhappiness. It means turning inward, taking responsibility, becoming free. So the next time you find yourself hurting, pause not to suppress it, but to see it. Ask yourself, what's the story here, and who's telling it? Because the world may not change in that moment, but your suffering might, not by force, but by insight. And in that insight, you begin to taste something deeper than comfort. You taste freedom. When you see clearly, you suffer less, not because life becomes easier, but because the mind no longer makes it harder. And from that clarity, a new understanding begins to take shape, one that reaches even deeper, because beyond the pain, beyond perception, there lies something even more subtle, the quiet engine that drives much of our suffering. We all carry a quiet blueprint of how life should be. It's unspoken, yet loud, invisible, yet powerful, built from childhood dreams, cultural norms, movies, beliefs, and whispers passed down from those who meant well. Love should last forever. Success should come if I work hard. People should be kind if I'm kind to them. Life should be fair. But life doesn't read blueprints. And when reality doesn't match the one we've drawn in our minds, something shatters inside us. Not because life failed, but because we were convinced it wouldn't. That shattering is expectation turning into suffering. Expectations are subtle architects. They build invisible cages around our peace. You may not see the bars, but you feel them. The tightness when someone doesn't text back, the sting when plans fall apart, the rage when things don't go your way. Not because the moment is painful, but because it defied the version of reality you expected. And that version, it only ever existed in your mind. There's a story of a young monk who was sent to live in a forest temple. He imagined a life of serenity, birdsong, gentle wind. But when he arrived, the roof leaked, the nights were cold, and the elder monks were strict and silent. He grew bitter, resentful, miserable. One day, the master approached and asked, "Are you suffering because of the forest, or because you imagined it would be different?" That single question cracked the illusion, because expectation isn't just about wanting good things. It's about demanding them quietly, clinging to how things should unfold, and when they don't, calling it unfair. But what if fairness isn't promised? What if the universe never agreed to your terms? The Buddha taught that suffering is born not from what we lack, but from our attachment to how we think things should be. And attachment hides in the folds of expectation. You expected them to stay. They left, You expected the job to fulfill you. It didn't. You expected your efforts to be rewarded. They weren't, and suddenly you're not just disappointed. You feel betrayed, but by whom? Expectation turns life into a contract you never sign with reality. You build your happiness on a script, scene by scene, line by line. But when the actors go off script, you suffer, and here's the trap. The mind convinces you the solution is to rewrite the world, to control outcomes, to make others behave. But the real freedom comes not from controlling the play, but from dropping the script altogether. You begin to see life not as something that owes you anything, but as something that simply is, unfolding, changing, breathing, not against you, not for you, just life as it is. Expectation says, I'll be happy when. Awareness says, I can be at peace now. Because the moment you stop arguing with reality, you begin to experience it, not through frustration but through presence. That's not passive, that's powerful. It means stepping out of the prison cell built by should and walking into the open field of what is. Imagine you're holding a rope tied to a wild horse, your expectations. The more the horse pulls, the tighter you grip. You scream, you fight, you demand it calm down, but it won't. Not because it's cruel, because that's its nature. Now imagine letting go, not in defeat, but in clarity. The horse runs, but you're free. This is not about giving up dreams. It's about releasing attachment to specific outcomes. It's about dreaming without clinging, loving without conditions, acting without guarantees. You can still work hard, still care deeply, still hope, but without turning your hope into a cage. When you drop the need for life to meet your expectations, you meet life finally and fully. You see people not as characters in your script, but as beings with their own paths. You see events not as personal attacks, but as natural waves in the ocean of existence. And slowly, you stop bracing for life to disappoint you, because now you're not waiting for it to match a blueprint. You're discovering it moment by moment. That discovery is freedom, not the freedom to get everything you want, but the freedom from needing to, because the less you expect, the more you see, and the more you see, the less you suffer. Awareness expands it. And in that expansion, something unexpected arises. Not disappointment, but deep, quiet joy. The kind that doesn't need to be earned, or arranged, or held tightly, just the kind that flows. When you finally let go, there's a quiet power hidden in how we choose to interpret life. Not in what happens, but in the meaning we give it. Because while the events may be beyond our control, the story we write about them, that part is ours. Every moment arrives as a blank page, but before we even notice, the mind starts scribbling. This is unfair. I'm a victim. This always happens to me. And just like that, the moment becomes a prison. But what if you could pause? What if you could look at the same moment, the same pain, the same disappointment, and write something new, not to deny the hurt, but to transform it? There's a story of a woman who was betrayed by someone she loved. For months, she carried the weight of it like armor. Anger, confusion, grief. She would say, "He ruined me. He broke my trust. I'll never recover." But one morning, something shifted. As she watched the sunrise spill across her bedroom wall, a thought whispered through the silence, or "He revealed me. He broke my illusion. And now I begin again." Same past, new perspective. And just like that, the script changed. In that moment, she took back her power, not by changing what happened, but by changing her relationship to it. This is the essence of transformation. The same reality, a new view, a new life. In Buddhist teaching, the mind is not a mirror. It's a projector. It doesn't just reflect life, it shapes it. And every thought, every belief, is like a frame in the film of your experience. You cannot always stop the reel, but you can choose the lens, painful memories, you can see them as curses, or as catalysts, failures, as dead ends, or doorways, loss, as punishment, or purification. The facts don't change, but you do, and that changes everything. Think of your life like a book, every chapter filled with joy, heartbreak, laughter, confusion. Some pages written in ink, some in tears. Now imagine going back, not to erase the story, but to reread it differently. You might see how pain pushed you toward growth, how endings created space for beginnings, how loneliness taught you to hear your own soul. Suddenly, what once seemed like the worst thing becomes the very thing that woke you up. And this isn't fantasy. This is perception, skillfully applied. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught about right view. Seeing clearly, without distortion, without grasping, without hatred. Right view isn't passive, it's revolutionary. It means saying, I can't control the waves, but I can learn to surf them. It means asking, is there another way to see this? Before reacting blindly, you start to question the old script, the inherited voice that says, you're not good enough. Life's out to get you. You'll never heal. And you begin to write something different. I am learning. I am transforming. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This doesn't mean pretending everything is okay. It means holding the pain with compassion, but not letting it harden into identity. It means honoring the wound, without becoming the wound, because every story has a turning point. And often, it's not when things get better outside. It's when the heart awakens inside. Perspective is power, and the most radical shift is realizing that nothing has to change. For everything to feel different, one breath, one insight, one moment of seeing things not as you fear them to be, but as they are, and suddenly the whole script is rewritten, not in ink, but in understanding, not in fantasy, but in freedom. So when life hands you a scene you didn't expect, pause, don't reach for blame, reach for clarity. Ask not, why is this happening to me? Ask, what is this trying to show me? Not every wound is a curse. Some are teachers. Not every ending is a failure. Some are sacred edits. And sometimes the story doesn't need a new plot. It just needs a new perspective. What if the world isn't what we think it is? What if most of what we suffer isn't caused by the moment itself, but by how the mind reflects that moment? There's a powerful metaphor in Buddhist teaching. The mind is like a mirror. Its nature is to reflect, pure, clear, unbiased, but over time the mirror gets clouded by dust, by stories, by past wounds, and then we look into that mirror and mistake the dust for the truth. Someone doesn't return our call. We see rejection, we feel abandoned. The mind whispers, you're not important. But is that real or just a reflection obscured? A plan falls apart. We see failure, we feel shame. The mind screams, you never get it right. But again, is that reality or just a cracked lens we've never cleaned? When the mind is unclear, suffering is automatic because you're not seeing what is. You're seeing what your pain expects. You're seeing through layers of old fears, unmet needs, inherited beliefs. The mirror doesn't lie, but if it's covered in dust, you'll believe the smudges are the sky. This is why the Buddha taught, clear seeing is the beginning of liberation. Not changing the world, not controlling people, just seeing clearly. Let that sink in. It's not the world that hurts you. It's your interpretation of it. It's not the noise that disturbs your peace. It's the way you resist it. It's not the past that keeps breaking your heart. It's the story you keep telling yourself about what it meant. And when the mirror is polished, when the mind is still and clean, reality stops being your enemy. It becomes your teacher. You start to see that everything, yes, everything, is just an event waiting for your meaning. A broken glass, Before the mind intervenes, it's just silence and shards. Then, I'm so clumsy, nothing goes right. This day is ruined. A simple delay, before thought rushes in, it's just space. Then, people don't respect me. Why does this always happen? But if the mind is clear, you breathe, you observe, you respond, not react, and suddenly, the glass is just glass. The delay is just time. The suffering, it never really existed, except in the mind. This is the liberation Buddhist teachings point toward, not that life becomes perfect, but that we see it without distortion, without craving, without aversion, without the dust. And when that happens, even pain changes shape, because when you stop fighting what is, you stop doubling the suffering, you stop saying, this shouldn't be happening. You start asking, can I meet this just as it is? And this simple shift, from resistance to awareness, turns the mirror into a gateway into wisdom, into compassion, into peace that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. Think of the mind like still water. When disturbed, it ripples and warps the reflection. You see monsters where there are none, threats where there is only wind, pain where there is only change. But when the water is calm, even the moon reflects clearly. This is why we meditate, not to escape life, but to clear the mirror, to return to that natural stillness, where things appear just as they are. No better, no worse, just real. And in that realness there is freedom. Freedom from illusion, freedom from emotional overreaction, freedom from the exhausting habit of living in the movie instead of watching it. So ask yourself gently, how much of what I suffer is actually happening now, and how much is just a projection? On the mirror of the mind, you'll be amazed at how much pain evaporates when you clean the glass, not with judgment, but with awareness, not with force, but with stillness. And in that clarity, even the hardest days become manageable. Even the heaviest emotions become teachers. Even the most confusing moments offer up their hidden truth. Suffering may still visit, but it won't build a home inside you, because now you know you're not the reflection, you're the mirror. And somewhere in that silence, you begin to realize you don't need to change the world to suffer less. You just need to see it clearly, and for that, you only need to return to what was already there beneath the dust. There's something heavy you've been carrying, maybe for years, maybe for lifetimes. And here's the thing, it's not the weight that's breaking you. It's how long you've been holding it. We all carry things we think we need, grudges that feel like justice, regrets that masquerade as responsibility, dreams that quietly became prisons, memories that no longer reflect who we are. But we keep staring at them, hoping they'll explain us. But what if the clarity you're searching for isn't in adding more to your mind, but in letting go of what clouds it? Because vision isn't about looking harder, it's about seeing with less in the way. The Buddha once held up a flower in silence. Just a flower, nothing said, nothing explained, and one monk smiled, only one. Because only one saw clearly, without thought, without clinging. What did he see? He saw suchness, reality as it is, not wrapped in judgment or personal meaning, just pure being. And that's the miracle of letting go. You begin to see not what you fear, not what you wish, but what truly is. Most of us walk around like this, one eye on the past, one eye on the future, and both eyes closed to the present. We're replaying old betrayals, gripping tightly to the people who hurt us, chasing versions of ourselves that don't exist anymore. And we wonder why life feels blurry. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean you approve of what happened. It means you finally understand. You don't have to carry the story to learn the lesson. You can drop the weight and still walk away wiser. In Buddhism, this is non-attachment, not rejection, not avoidance, but a soft release. Like unclenching your fist. After holding sand for too long, It's the practice of saying, this thought came, this feeling came, this identity came, I honor it, but I don't have to become it. Because when you cling, you distort. The past looks larger than life. The future looks smaller than hope, and the present disappears entirely. But when you let go, the world stops spinning in your head. It slows, it softens, it becomes livable again. A great Zen master once said, let go or be dragged. Dragged by your ego, dragged by your expectations, dragged by people who live rent-free in your mind. And yet we cling because we believe letting go is losing. But that's the lie. Letting go isn't loss, it's liberation. It's not giving up, it's waking up. To realize that you were never holding on to them. You were holding on to your idea of them. That you weren't holding on to certainty. You were holding on to control. That the pain wasn't in the thing itself. It was in your refusal to release it. So ask yourself gently, what are you gripping that's already gone? What memory, identity, or opinion is still shaping how you see the world? Because vision is a sacred thing. When it's clear, you can love again. You can trust again. You can live without your past constantly dragging its shadow across every new beginning. You begin to feel spacious inside, like air, like sky, like possibility. And what's beautiful is, you don't have to force the letting go. You only have to see clearly that clinging is suffering. That recognition alone is enough to soften the grip. Imagine someone holding a burning coal, refusing to drop it because they want to throw it at someone. But the longer they hold it, the more they burn. That's what we do with resentment, with perfectionism, with identities we've outgrown. We keep saying, I can't let this go. But the truth is, it's already gone. We're just choosing to suffer its echo. Letting go doesn't remove the pain. It removes the attachment to pain. And suddenly, the mind becomes like a clean window. You don't have to strain to see beauty. You don't have to try so hard to feel peace. It's already there. It was always there. You just had to stop looking through the fog of what no longer serves you. So if today you feel heavy, if life feels complicated, ask yourself not what more you can do, but what you're ready to release. Maybe it's a belief, maybe it's a fear, maybe it's a version of yourself that you no longer need to protect. Whatever it is, know this: the moment you let go, you don't lose who you are, you return to who you are. And from that place, you see more clearly, you love more honestly, you walk through the world with eyes wide open, and hands wide open too, because freedom isn't about escaping, it's about embracing with nothing clenched, and nothing clouding your sight. And maybe, just maybe, the next time something arises in you that says, hold on, you'll pause and ask, or could I let this pass? And in that one gentle release, the vision clears, and the world begins to shine, as it always has, beneath all the things we no longer need. There's a strange thing that happens when you clean a window. The world outside suddenly looks brighter, clearer, more alive. But the world didn't change. You did. That's the secret hidden in plain sight. The world is not as it is as you are. Your mind is the lens. Your heart is the filter. Your beliefs, your wounds, your hopes. They tint everything you see. So when you say, this world is dark, maybe your eyes are tired. When you say, people are selfish, maybe it's your trust that's been bruised. And when you say, nothing ever changes, maybe it's because you haven't let yourself change. Reality mirrors you. It reflects not your words, but your inner state. Just like a lake reflects the sky. Calm when you're calm, stormy when you're raging. That's why transformation is not about escaping the world. It's about coming home to yourself and watching the world respond accordingly. Buddhism teaches this through a single profound insight. All phenomena arise in dependence upon the mind. Your suffering isn't in the world. It's in the meaning you attach to it. Your joy isn't in the circumstances. It's in your capacity to be present within them. We've all seen it. Two people go through the same challenge. One becomes bitter, the other becomes wise. What made the difference? It wasn't the event. It was who they were when they met it. Your perception is creative. It doesn't just observe the world. It shapes it. If you walk through life expecting betrayal, you'll notice every slight. If you carry shame, you'll interpret kindness as pity, silence as judgment. But if you walk with openness, suddenly the world softens around you. The mind that meets the moment creates the moment. That's why the Buddha didn't focus on changing the world. He focused on awakening the mind. Because when the mind is clear, even hardship becomes a teacher, even pain becomes a doorway, even the mundane becomes holy. This is not just spiritual poetry. It's practical transformation. Think about it. You can't control the economy. You can't control other people's choices. You can't even control tomorrow. But you can shape the one thing that shapes everything, the way you show up. Your inner world, your clarity, your peace, your presence. And from that place, you don't just change how you see. You change what's possible, like the monk who sees suffering in a hungry child and builds an orphanage, like the parent who turns their childhood pain into tenderness for their own children, like the person who stops running from themselves and finds that self-love spills into every relationship they touch. Your transformation is not isolated, it ripples. Because when you change, you interrupt the pattern, you break the cycle. You introduce kindness where there was only pain, patience where there was only reaction, wisdom where there was only fear, and little by little, that changes the world, not by force, not by control, but by resonance. Because your being becomes medicine, your presence becomes invitation, your stillness becomes a mirror for others to see themselves. This is why the true revolution is always internal. No slogan, no movement, no external battle can change what a single awakened heart can shift, just by how it sees. So ask yourself not just, what do I want to change in the world? But, what do I need to change in myself to see that world clearly? Maybe it's the judgment you carry like a shield. Maybe it's the fear that closes you off. Maybe it's the old wound that whispers, you're not enough. Whatever it is, start there, because the moment you bring compassion inward, you begin to see with new eyes outward, and you'll notice something miraculous. That angry coworker, maybe they're in pain. That stranger's rudeness, maybe they're lost in a storm you'll never know. That part of you once hated, maybe it was just trying to protect you. The world softens. As you soften, the same streets feel safer, the same sky feels wider. The same people seem more human, because they're no longer filtered through the smoke of your suffering. You don't need a new job, a new body, a new life. You need a new way of seeing the one you already have. And that sight comes not from striving, but from returning to presence, to stillness, to the quiet knowing that when your mind clears, the world becomes radiant again. So the invitation isn't to fix the world, it's to transform yourself. And watch the world transform in response. The world is not against you, it's not punishing you. It's simply reflecting what you bring to it. Bring fear and you'll find reasons to run. Bring love and you'll find places to bloom. And if you change the lens, you change the life. You don't need to change the world to find peace. You need to see clearly enough to recognize that peace was never outside you to begin with. It was always waiting on the other side of your perception. There comes a moment, quiet, still, almost unnoticeable, when the fog begins to lift. You're not sure when it started. Maybe it was a question, a breath, a crack in your certainty, but suddenly, the noise quiets, and for the first time, you see, not through your past, not through your fears, not through the lens of who you think you're supposed to be. You see the world as it is, not perfect, not broken, just alive. Have you ever looked at a tree really looked? Not as a tree, but as presence, still, silent, rooted in being, asking for nothing. That's awakening, not fireworks, not a voice from the sky, but the gentle remembrance that reality was always here, beneath your interpretations, beneath your drama, beneath the stories you told yourself 1,000 times, beneath the labels, good, bad, right, wrong, success, failure, me, them. It was all noise, echoes in a hall of mirrors, reflections of reflections of reflections. But awakening is when you stop chasing the mirror and turn toward the light. It's when you realize you were never trapped by life. You were trapped by the way you looked at life. The Buddha once said, "With our thoughts we make the world." But he didn't mean the world was a dream. He meant we dream on top of it. We overlay our wounds. We smear our projections. We try to bend reality to fit our pain, instead of allowing it to free us. And yet, when the mind becomes still, when the need to judge falls away, you begin to notice there is beauty in everything. In a wrinkled face that tells stories of survival, in a broken bowl that still holds water, in a moment of silence between two people who finally stopped pretending, you begin to see life in layers, not just the surface, but the depth, the essence. And you see others not as threats, not as tools, not as characters in your personal movie, but as beings, trying, failing, learning just like you. That's why awakening is never arrogant. It's not loud. It doesn't need to convince anyone of anything. It's like a candle in a dark room. It doesn't scream at the shadows. It simply shines. You become aware of your thoughts without being ruled by them. You watch emotions rise and fall without drowning in them. You experience pain without turning it into suffering. Because you know now, the world is not here to obey you. It's not here to match your expectations. It's here to wake you up, to show you where you're still clinging, still judging, still hiding from yourself. And as you awaken, you stop blaming the storm. You learn how to stand in the rain without needing the sky to clear. You learn how to love without demanding anything in return. You learn how to walk through the fire without burning others along the way. You learn how to be alone without being lonely, because at the heart of awakening is a deep, unwavering peace, not the kind you get when everything goes your way, but the kind that remains even when nothing does. And from that peace comes clarity. You see that the world is not here to please you, but to teach you, to reflect you, to call you deeper into the truth of who you really are, not the roles, not the mask, not the persona that worked in the past, but the awakened presence that sees clearly and loves anyway. You no longer need to fix everyone. You no longer need to win every argument. You no longer need to be understood, approved, or praised, because you found something deeper than validation. You found truth, and truth doesn't shout, it whispers. Through the rustling leaves, through the still breath, through the unshakable knowing that this moment is enough, just as it is, because you are enough, just as you are. And in that moment, the world no longer needs to change, because you have. So now the question is, how can I make the world different? Can I see it clearly enough to meet it with love? Because that is the final threshold of awakening. And once crossed, there's no going back. You've walked through fog, you've touched the mirror, you've watched your thoughts like clouds in a vast, open sky. And now, you're standing in a new kind of light. It's not brighter, it's just clearer. It doesn't blind you. It reveals. All this time you thought the world needed fixing, that people needed to change, that circumstances needed to align just right for you to feel peace. But now you see, it wasn't the world, it was how you were looking at it. It was the old lens of fear, of scarcity, of ego always trying to survive. Instead of simply being, you changed that. You slowed down, you listened, you turned inward. And what you found there wasn't emptiness, but a quiet wholeness you'd forgotten was always yours. Now every moment becomes a teacher, every breath becomes a doorway, every person becomes a mirror. You no longer run from discomfort, you greet it. You meet yourself in it. You no longer chase happiness like a destination. You discover it, right here, in this breath, in this now, when you see clearly. You stop trying to control the world. You start dancing with it. You stop reacting. You start responding. From a deeper place, from stillness, from wisdom. And the magic, the world reflects you back. What once felt like chaos becomes sacred rhythm. What once felt like isolation becomes spacious connection. What once felt like burden becomes gentle invitation. This is the shift. Not outside, but within you change. And so does the world. Not because the world transformed, but because your vision did. This is the quiet revolution of awakening. Not loud, not flashy, but real. You become the still eye in the storm. The flame that doesn't flicker in the wind. The presence that no longer needs to be anything other than what it is. And in that presence, life opens its palms and whispers, "Welcome back. You were never lost, only looking through the wrong eyes." So if this journey stirred something within you, if it reminded you of what you already knew deep down, or if it simply offered a quiet moment of clarity, then stay with us. Let's keep walking this path together. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more stories, more silence, more truth, shared from the heart, with no rush, no noise, just the timeless wisdom you already carry within. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for remembering